Fashion Tech Alliance involves higher educational institutions, small, medium and big enterprises and the research center. This project has been co-founded by the Erasmus Plus program of the European Union and is aimed to facilitate knowledge exchange between partners and to design and pilot learning experiences to engage students in a fashion tech residency program, embedding young talents in the company's innovation activities. A central objective of the project is to design multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary and intersectoral learning activities involving international students from 5 European universities. The contents of the lectures have been specifically created to match the needs of fashion tech learning. They have become open educational resources to allow future engagement between a European-wide fashion and textile HEI community and are available under Creative Commons Share-alike 4.0 with the aim of a wide and free distribution, access, use and reuse. Ready to learn more about fashion tech? Enjoy the lecture.
Hello, my name is Douglas Atkinson and I'm a lecturer in wearable technology at London College of Fashion. In this lecture, I'm going to briefly introduce various low-tech methods for prototyping different types of technology designs, and I'm going to hopefully prove to you that you need very few resources to successfully prototype an interaction. Everything I'm going to introduce you to today is an accessible method that hopefully you should all be able to do in your home, and the key resources really are your creativity and your body to get you to think through an interaction. So, the contents of this lecture will be storyboarding, which you may be familiar with. Storyboarding is a drawing process that gets you to think through each stage of an interaction. So really, frame by frame, staging an interaction. In some ways, this is very similar to wireframing, which is the next topic we will discuss. Wireframing takes this approach, but applies it to the design of an interface, or of the visual component of any interactive technology. So if you imagine it as a way of creating a low-tech prototype of a phone interface or of a website, which are both common applications for wireframing. Next, we will discuss paper and cardboard prototyping. The definitions of these are somewhat blurred, but generally these are processes which take the idea of frame-by-frame prototyping a process and make them more physical and bring them into a kind of tangible world that you can interact with your body. And then finally, this lecture will close by exploring the idea of bodystorming. And bodystorming, as it sounds from the name, is very similar to brainstorming, but it's all about using your body and working with physical actions to prototype. So as I said, lots of accessible methods, and this lecture is really just to give you an overview of the potential of all of these to help you prototype a process or a design idea you have. So, this is my message for the lecture. What can you learn about interactive technology using paper, a pen, and the body? So there's absolutely no code involved, and all of these processes are used by designers before they usually go near a technology prototype. So these are really to get quite deeply into an understanding of the interaction, which will then be prototyped using code or using technology afterwards. So the idea is to iron out all the potential issues with the interactivity before you prototype anything using technology. So, the first method I'm going to discuss is storyboards. And as I said, storyboards may be fairly familiar to some of you, particularly if you come from a design background, or even if you think of the way you would prototype or represent a film or a play or any kind of acted media. So they're quite commonly used for developing storylines in film. They're also useful to think about in terms of cartoon strips. So very similarly to the way a cartoon strip shows a stage-by-stage process, this is what you do in a storyboard. You draw each stage of an interactive process. So this is quite important because this act of drawing and this act of showcasing a stage-by-stage process gets you to think about the detail of what you will need to do to trigger an action, to respond to an action. So in a storyboard for an interaction design, what we're looking for is not the graphic style. It's not a beautiful drawing. It doesn't have to be a kind of pitch or a beautiful communicative object. It's for you to think through stages. So if you want to draw stickmen, if you're not an artist, that's fine. All you need to think about is the detail of the actions at each stage. So are you forgetting an action? So when you're thinking about developing an app, for instance, it's very easy to think that a process will be smooth and will have less actions than it might include. And so how many different actions are required of someone using your technology? What kind of bodily actions are required from someone using your technology? And drawing them also helps you to situate them in the real world, in a real life context. So perhaps try storyboarding the use of an interactive prototype you're considering in different places. Take it outside of the home, take it away from a desk, and just see how people might use it differently. And those storyboards start to tell you whether it's a widely usable technology or whether it has a particular context. So it's a fairly simple process, and hopefully that's enough of an introduction to get you to think about it. But remember that with storyboarding for interactions, we're looking for stage-by-stage processes, and we're looking for detail. So the next process I'm going to discuss is wireframing. And this is very, very similar. The only difference is that wireframing is usually talked about in the context of developing an interface. So it's often used to prototype websites, it's often used to prototype apps. And again, you don't need to draw anything beautifully, but you need to draw the stages of a process. So draw each stage of a visual interface. And in this image, we're looking at stages of using an app. So whenever you might ask someone to make a choice, whenever someone might have to click or trigger a function, this is the point where you want to draw that stage so that you can understand how someone progresses from one point to the next. And as an exercise, you can test this out by looking at a website that perhaps you use quite often, or looking at an application on your phone that you use quite often, and just try to draw each stage. Think about every time you have to make a choice, every time you have to select something, and draw and map each of these. So effectively, you're mapping your journey through an interface. And that's the idea of wireframing. You want to map the journey of your user, whoever that may be, or the person experiencing your interactive technology. And you want to look at the transitions. So this is why I was talking about each stage and thinking about when you have to make a choice. Those are the moments of transition. And understanding how you transition from one visual representation to the next, or one piece of content to the next, is really important. And it helps you to understand if the interface is intuitive, or if it has too many stages, if it actually asks too much of the user. And generally with web design, and particularly with app design, the expectation is that you would try and streamline the process as much as possible. And this applies to anything. This applies to how you would interact with any technology worn on the body, because you don't want to make the owner of your wearable device work too hard to use it. We're used to very, very intuitive technologies, and that's because they've gone through very thorough processes of wireframing, of prototyping, to understand how we use and interact with them. So think about these stages and transitions. Are there too many stages, and can you make it simpler? Do you need a transition to be particularly graphically intensive? Do you need the transition itself to be an important part of the experience? Or do you want to make it as seamless as possible? So those are some decisions you can make while wireframing a visual interface. Again, that was a fairly simple process and hopefully fairly intuitive. Now I'm going to talk to you about paper and sometimes cardboard prototyping, and the distinctions between these and wireframing, or even kind of creating a storyboard, can sometimes be a bit blurred. Usually the idea behind paper prototyping, and particularly with the process people refer to as cardboard prototyping, is to make something that comes off a page, to make something that's a physical prototype. And I'll talk to you a little bit more about both of those things as we go through the next few slides. So paper prototyping, as you can see here, is sometimes discussed as a way of effectively animating either a storyboard or a wireframe. So in this example image, really what's happened is that some of the stages and the transitions that I talked to you about have been made into individual images, individual pieces that can be moved around, that can be animated into an idea of how someone would use this particular app that they're developing. So it's to try and get a bit more of a feel for something as a realistic user interface or a realistic interactive object. So that animation can help you to see, again, if you have too many stages, if you're kind of making things complicated for your user, and where you can streamline the process. Now, where the definitions of paper prototyping, cardboard prototyping, and wireframing become slightly blurred is when we think more about cardboard prototyping. And this is not a term that's universally used to describe how this process works, but it generally is used to denote the making of a physical mock-up. So rather than just making your wireframe interactive, it's really making a kind of lo-fi object. And it's something that we can all do when we're creating a technology prototype, is just to very quickly try and understand the physicality of it. So again, taking it off the page, but in this case, taking it into a form that you can manipulate with your body. You can understand the three-dimensionality and the qualities of it in relation to your movements, to your actions, and to how you would situate it on your own body. So that's very important for something wearable. We all need to understand whether something is actually going to sit on the body in the place we imagine it will, whether it will function well there. So a good example is wearable cameras, which were kind of briefly popular about 4 or 5 years ago. But the issue with wearable cameras was that they often didn't capture a useful perspective on what they were photographing. And that's because quite often they were worn as necklaces or brooches. So that's an example where having a physical object to situate on your body can really help you to think through your prototype. So for those of you who come from a fashion design background, I tend to refer to cardboard prototypes as a form of toile for technology. So it's a very, very rough initial way of making a physical object. And again, you can treat this as a process in which you can try and animate the interaction. So if you want to make representations of stages of how your object may change or how it may be animated, you can create these in exactly the same way as you would with a paper prototype and swap the different stages of the process so that you can visualize them. So I hope that gives you an idea of why you might use paper and cardboard prototyping. And generally, I encourage people to use these processes as a very kind of early stage way of mocking up an interaction. But it is actually possible to use them in a very high fidelity way to make really well realized, really effective communicative videos around the prototype you want to make. So this video will hopefully give you an idea of how you can use cardboard and paper prototyping to really persuasively sell a technology concept. So I hope that gave you a flavour of just how well a cardboard or paper prototype can showcase a technology concept. The important things that cardboard and paper prototypes help you to realise is the difference between what you think you will do when using a technology or using an interface and what you'll actually do. And that becomes even more critical when you look at bodystorming. So all of the previous methods have used your imagination, but that's not always the most useful way to prototype. Sometimes you need to really physically act something out to understand what the reality of using an interactive technology will be. And this is where bodystorming becomes a really, really effective tool. So bodystorming often combines paper prototypes with role play and acting out a scenario. And the good thing is you can actually embody different people in this process. So you can think about how different people might use your technology. You can even embody a thing or an animal and think differently about how you might use something. Or you can constrain how you might use your body. And that's really helpful for thinking about accessibility issues and how you can make your technology as widely accessible as possible, as usable by as many different people. So I'm going to just talk you through some of these ideas briefly now. So one of the interesting and fun aspects of bodystorming is that it can be used to think about how you can do a task differently. So if you want to create a new and unusual interactive experience, maybe that's useful, maybe that's helpful because we all interact with technology in fairly similar ways. So how can you be innovative? How can you create a different experience? And some ways of doing this are to, as I mentioned before, either think about someone else using this technology or go completely off the wall and think about a different perspective. And an interesting example is with the use of animals. This prompt from the set of toolkit cards asks you to actually imitate how an animal might touch or sense. And that invites you to think about how you could potentially extend the human sensory experience when working with an interactive technology. So thinking about how touch could be relocated from the hands to different parts of the body, thinking about how you may use touch as part of your daily routine or the activities that you engage in. So really thinking away from your conventional expectations of an interaction or of a sensory or a visual experience. So that's really the idea of embodying like a different species. Embodying a different user or a different person is something that can help with empathy. So rather than creating a really unusual creative context for an interaction, it can help you to think about how best your interaction can suit a wider body of people. So this can bring in considerations of different bodies, different accessibility levels, or even just different personal preferences around an experience. So again, this card from the same toolkit talks about acting out your response to proximity or your response to wanting touch. And particularly in the pandemic, we've discovered that there are many, many different kind of quite complex politics around touch. And understanding those, if you're working with an interactive technology that assumes perhaps you have touch screens, you have buttons, or even you have an interactive touch experience between more than one person, requires you to really think about personal boundaries and personal levels of acceptability. And so that's where acting out an idea of being differently kind of either very happy for someone to touch or being very resistant to someone touching gets you to think about how different people with different levels of comfort around touch could engage with your technology. And this can apply to all sorts of other things. So these examples that I've used relate to touch because that's one of the strong themes in my own research. But you can also think about how you could embody someone who has a different, for example, a different level of visual fidelity. So is your user interface very friendly to people who may have visual impairments or who may not actually be using their sight to engage with it? So it's really a considerate design process in many ways. And that level of consideration can move from just considering people's differences of opinion all the way through to considering different abilities and different bodies. So this is how you get to think differently and do a task differently in relation to who your user might be and how they might interact with something. So it moves on from the really creative idea of embodying a different person, a different animal, a different scenario, to embodying different people in a scenario that you're now trying to define. So as a really strong example of bodystorming, this is a past project from the Education for Fashion Tech project, which was a precursor to FT Alliance. And this was a bodystorming process that a group engaged in to develop a wearable technology, a garment in this case, which was able to give feedback on posture and technique for cello playing. So it was conceived as a garment for remote tuition for students who wanted to learn the cello and maybe were quite far apart from their tutor or were engaged in one-to-many learning. So for example, if you had one tutor trying to teach multiple students. And what they really wanted to understand was, first of all, the physical location on the body in which they would need to offer padding and in which they would need to add vibration feedback so that it would sit well with playing the cello. And this again ties back to my example with cardboard prototyping around locating an interaction on the body, or even just locating an object on the body. So in this case, it was quite critical for them to understand some of the physicality of playing the cello to know where to locate an interaction. And this can extend to moving an experience to a different part of the body. So an analogy there would be trying to tell the time with a different part of the body than your wrist, where watches are conventionally located. So you can test out all of these things. This was really just a nice example of how you can use anything you can find around a studio. In this case, it was a cardboard tube to represent the cello sat on the shoulder, and informed quite a strong process of really thinking about body posture, about movement while playing the cello. And so I hope that gives you an example to think about your concepts and how you might bodystorm them or locate them on the body. Now, one of the critical aspects of bodystorming is that you should act out your concept. Don't just talk about it. So don't just sell your idea and don't just demonstrate it. It's easy to feel a little bit uncomfortable or feel like maybe you'll look a bit silly acting something out. But the point is that you need to see what really happens when you engage with an interactive technology. So it's very easy to make an idea sound good, but will your sales pitch stand up to being acted out? Will your sales pitch stand up to testing out an interaction in the real world? And that's another stage that people often go to with bodystorming, is to take an interactive process out into the wild and to test it with the public around them. And that can give you a really good idea of whether you're creating something that actually is maybe too unusual, too distinct to interact with in a public space, and therefore it's not going to be socially accepted. So I'm going to leave you with some key considerations for low-tech prototyping. As I've mentioned, all interaction and experience design involves exploring processes. And these methods are very simple ways to get you to think about stages of a process. So thinking about the minutiae of each stage, thinking about them in detail, that's really important. And you don't need a perfect aesthetic. You don't need to be a beautiful illustrator to create a storyboard. You don't need to create the perfect cardboard prototype, because these prototypes are testing your experience and they're making you think. Those are their two key roles. So they're revealing stages of an interaction process that you may not have previously considered. As I mentioned with the idea of testing some of these interactions in the wild, consider the social implications of the interactive technology that you're designing. And that can be something that you can reveal quite quickly by working with members of your group if you're designing interactive technology together, or as I said, by taking it into the wild, and considering whether people think that it's too unusual, whether people think they will engage with it, and how often people think they will use it and where. So the social is equally important to the functional experience of your prototype, and that's something that Bodystorming in particular can reveal. And as I said, sometimes you might feel self-conscious, and sometimes you probably will feel self-conscious, but that's a good thing. That's a useful part of the process. And I always leave people with this analogy. Imagine how you would feel if you worked for a multi-billion-dollar tech company and you developed a technology spending millions and millions of pounds, dollars, or euros to create a technology that you didn't fully consider. And although for Google, they had enough money that this probably didn't matter and was a really interesting exercise in technology development, Google Glass is a really strong example of a technology that perhaps wasn't strongly enough tested through things like Bodystorming and actually in the wild testing, because it failed to meet people's social expectations. It wasn't socially accepted as a usable technology in the wild. So don't be distracted by the potential of a technology. Don't be distracted by something being new and being interesting. Always prototype. And that doesn't need to involve any code or any technology. Just you, a pen, some cardboard, or some paper. So I'll leave you with that thought. Always prototype, and thank you for listening.